Welcome to this introduction on exercise physiology principles. In this video, as you can see, we discuss the 5 principles or laws that really govern all our exercising efforts and outcomes. So let's get started. The first principle speaks to one of the body's 5 major functions, which is responsiveness, if you can recall. And the principle of responsiveness is captures one of the most unique features of biological organisms, and that's the fact that not only can we recover from a stress, we can heal from injury and infection. Not only can we do that, but we actually can become better and adapt and become stronger as a result of that. So we really are anti-fragile. And so the responsiveness principle speaks to our anti-fragility, that if we are going to become something different, something new, we have to undergo some kind of transformation. And that transformation includes, in this case, controlled doses of stress and micro trauma and injury, obviously not infection, for us to become better. And so there are 3 concepts related to the principle of responsiveness that speaks to this transformation. And it really represents what I call the stimulus response cycle, meaning in order for us to undergo a positive physiological adaptation, whether that's in strength or muscle and fat loss or cardiovascular fitness, we need to expose the body to a stress response pattern unique to the adaptation that we want. Then we need to remove the stimulus, the stress response, recover and repair, which is what we call acute adaptation. And then if we do that multiple times over long periods of time, then we have a chronic adaptation. So for example, actually the next slide shows this. So we undergo a stress response like when we exercise, and assuming that the stress response was intense and long enough, then it will stimulate what we call an adaptive response. We will repair and recover from that adaptive response given enough recovery, and then we'll undergo an adaptation. Obviously, what you're seeing here is not, we don't obviously grow that much muscle in a single stress response. So this would represent a single stimulus response cycle, but imagine, we accumulate multiple stimulus response cycles over long periods of time, and the body will start to change if we expose ourselves to that particular type of stress pattern frequently and consistently enough. Okay. Next, we've got progressive overload. So remember, we just talked about the fact that if the body is going to undergo a positive physiological adaptation where we get stronger, where we get fitter, where we, our bodies become leaner, then we need to have a stress response that actually is going to be intense and long enough. And so overload really is this exercise-induced disruption in our homeostasis, right? The acute response of the body. That should be intense and long enough to trigger this adaptive response in our body's functional abilities, which again is the acute adaptation. So we exercise, that's the acute response. Remember our heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, body fluid changes, blood pH, changes. All these changes is the acute response to a stress. And in this case, it's either going to be, resistance training, or it could be cardiovascular training, or it could even be stretching, but there's some kind of a stress response. And again, if it's intense and if it's long enough, then it would be adequate to stimulate an adaptive response. Progressive overload then means we adjust the exercise intensity to match our rate of improvement, right? So every time we get stronger. So really the word overload is not accurate because we're never overloading ourselves. We're actually loading the body to our maximum capability, because just past our maximum capability, is flirting with injury. And so we never really go past that point. So we never really overload. We could say we maximally load the system. And if we don't maximally load the system, we will not stimulate an adaptive response that we want. And we can either stimulate an adaptive response in terms of our neuromusculature, our bioenergetics, our energy systems, and our biomechanics, and usually a combination of all 3. And so progressive overload just means that we're overloading the body, or actually we're maximally loading the body today, and then we recover the acute adaptation, And then once we've recovered, we actually become a little bit stronger, which means if we go do the exact same workout that we did before, it doesn't feel as bad, it's less intense, we can actually do more. And so we need to match the intensity back to our current new baseline level of strength. This image here beautifully captures the concept of progressive overload. Of course, we have the ancient Greek wrestler Milo of Croton here, who was thought to have carried his own calf every single day, and that as his calf grew, he would become as strong. His strength would grow in proportion to the size of the calf, allowing him to carry a full-fledged bull by the time he was older as well as the bull. One of my favorite quotes is by Arthur Jones, also speaking to the principle of progressive overload. It is simply impossible to build muscular size or strength by performing that which you're already capable of doing. You must constantly attempt the momentarily impossible, and such attempts should involve maximum possible efforts. Absolutely. Now, this doesn't mean every workout, especially if you train 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. But again, if you're doing 10x, you're training once or twice a week. But this doesn't mean that you overload or maximally load your body every single time you train. But it does mean that if you are serious about stimulating that adaptive response, you have to go at minimum towards the edge of your capabilities, or try to go slightly beyond them without injury, if we are going to be continuously pushing our maximum capabilities. There are 4 very important things that we have to consider when it comes to the progressive overload principles. Things to always keep in mind when it comes to constantly stress the body, maximally load it to produce an adaptive response. All biological adaptations are subject to logarithmic growth as opposed to exponential growth. You see there are 2 types of growth. Exponential means that you see slow growth and eventually growth just shoots up, so it's almost exponential and almost as if it doesn't end. That's not true of biological systems. In fact, what you see with biological systems, physiology, you see rapid improvement, and then we start to see it slow down, and then eventually it plateaus, meaning we don't see any progress. It's important to understand that, because if you hit a plateau, it doesn't mean you're on the wrong program. You're hitting a plateau because you're starting to approximate your genetic potential. The closer you get to your genetic potential for a particular variable, particular adaptation, okay, the more overload resistant you become to that program for that adaptation. So that means you'll have to spend way more time. You'll have to change many of the variables of your program in order to get there. But that's very time consuming. And most people are kind of satisfied with the amount of growth that they can get with the, let's say, amount of time that they're willing to put in. No one wants to necessarily reach their genetic potential for a particular variable. That can be like a lifelong endeavor. But it's important to understand, however, despite the fact that we have a genetic cap, you always want to show up as if you don't. You train as if you don't have a limit, but you always, in the back of your mind, you are a reasonable person, knowing that you can't grow infinitely, so you put your expectations in context. Okay, so adaptation window speaks to the fact that, again, as we reach our genetic potential, that is the window, the difference between where we are and our genetic ceiling. That's the adaptation window. And the more that window closes, again, the more complex the training variables have to become for us to completely close that window, which we already discussed. And so this basically leads us to make certain trade-offs, right? We say, okay, I'm not going to reach my genetic potential for this particular variable. Let's say it's maximum strength, but then I get to spend more time on other things like cardiovascular endurance or extreme flexibility. And in some cases, you can achieve or approximate your genetic potential for, let's say, strength, flexibility, and endurance. But again, your whole life will probably have to revolve around exercise in order to do that. So this image here illustrates what I was saying. So on the vertical axis here, we have the rate of adaptation, and then we have the horizontal axis here, the time in months. And so we see rapid growth in the first year, and then we start to slow down after about 2 years. Again, this graph is not particularly accurate for 10x specifically, but this is a graph that is very representative of strength as an adaptation. And so here we have rapid growth, and then we start to slow down, approximating our genetic potential. And you see here, this graph illustrates the fact that the need for training complexity grows in proportion to the rate at which we close our adaptation window. Here is basically the adaptation lifespan. So imagine that the horizontal axis here represents time, but in terms of life stages rather than months. Let's say as a 20-year-old, you could get as strong as you possibly can, and maybe through your 30s and 40s, reach your strength potential relative to the amount of time that you're putting in, and then no matter what we do after a long period of time, as we age between the age of 50 and 60, we will start to decline, no matter no matter how complex the training stimulus becomes. Okay, so now we move on to the principle of reversibility. So the reversibility principle is the idea that, well, as its name suggests, that we return back to a preconditioned baseline state, absent continuous exposure to the same exercise stimulus, right? So as we get stronger and stronger and stronger, if we remove the strength training stimulus, or as we get more and more flexible, as we remove the stretching stimulus, we tend to return back towards a baseline state. It kind of sucks, right? Because it means we're doomed to continuously expose the body to this stimulus to retain those adaptive capabilities. So the question then becomes, okay, so if most of the accrued adaptations that we've accumulated over our training career reverses slowly towards a preconditioned baseline state, what's the minimum we have to do to keep reversibility at bay? That's number one. And number two, right, what's the minimum to, let's say, stay healthy, and what's the minimum to, let's say, maintain and hold on to, let's say, our peak fitness level? So looking at this slide again, assuming this line represents a conditioned state, so it's above a healthy baseline state, meaning we're fitter than the average person, we expose the body to a certain stimulus, let's say it's a strength training stimulus, where we fatigue the body deeply enough to stimulate an adaptive response, and provided we get sufficient recovery, the difference between this pre-stressed state and now our recovered state would have been sufficient to stimulate an adaptive response. Now we're a little bit fitter, a little bit stronger. But again, and then the reversibility principle demonstrates here that a removal of that stimulus over a long enough period of time means we actually go back towards this conditioned state and towards a completely healthy baseline state where we started. Next, we move on to the second last principle, known as the principle of specificity. Okay, so this principle states that the adaptive response is highly specific to the structural, metabolic, and movement demands of our exercise. Okay, this has multiple implications, because this means that if the body only adapts in the way that we use it, it begs the question then, well, how should we use it? Because if it's not as transferable as we used to think, because it's not, meaning if I train my balance on a Bozo ball, I quickly discover that it's like if I try to do, let's say, tightrope walking or slacklining, they don't transfer. It's like I have to learn the skill of balance on the slackline like from scratch, just like any beginner. So they're not as transferable as we used to think. I mean, obviously there's some general foundation with which you can have a better advantage, but it's not as straightforward. So, and it's the same with strength. So for example, let's say you learn how to build strength in a squat with a barbell. It doesn't perfectly translate to other activities, although, of course, you do bring with it a foundation of strength to other activities. So it really begs the question, if the body only adapts in the way that you use it, how should we use the body? Which is a problem that I try to solve in the next couple of slides. But remember, the body, you adapt in 3 specific ways. So every exercise program really is nothing but a stress pattern. An exercise or an exercise program is a stress pattern that you expose the body to over long periods of time so that you can produce a specific adaptation. And those stress patterns come in 3 categories: neuromuscular, bioenergetics, and biochemical. It's really the same thing of saying structural, metabolic, and movement. It means that the exercise that you do will have a muscle fiber and neuromuscular component to it. It will have an energy system component to it, and it will have a movement pattern associated with it. And that the adaptation is very specific to all three at the same time. So let me give you an example. So in this image, as you can see, the actual movement pattern is identical. The only difference is the speed at which you train. So both of these athletes here are runners, essentially, but the one trains and runs very, very fast, which means he uses a different energy system. He uses an anaerobic energy system, and the marathon runner here uses an aerobic energy system. And again, when you use the aerobic energy system, you're using type 1 muscle fiber, which are our smaller, slow twitch muscle fibers. Whereas the sprinter uses predominantly type 2, fast twitch, really strong, really big muscle fibers. And again, the more you use them, the more the body will adapt to express them. And so, again, the question I ask you here is, how would you, like, the question you need to be thinking of is, what do I want to look like? How strong do I want to be? How flexible do I want to be? What endurance capacity do I want to possess? And so you will need to always look for a stress pattern, a program that will basically stimulate the neuromuscular, bioenergetic, or biomechanical patterns of the adaptations that you seek. On the right-hand side, we see an image that is essentially identical to the one on the left, but just for females, so you can see it's the same in both genders. Now, there are 3 specificity domains that really solves the problem of transferability, meaning, remember, if the adaptations that we accrue in response to a specific type of exercise program is highly specific to the way that we move, then it really, again, that begs the question then, how can we exercise or move that will have the most transference to other types of activities? And for me, it's quite simple. The closer the exercise mimics our foundational or functional movement patterns, the more transferable they'll be. So the foundational domain speaks to the fact that at the very minimum, you don't have to train for sport or to try to fulfill your physical potential, let's say like someone like me. But at minimum, you want to exercise in a way that mimics the basic functional and foundational movement patterns that prepare you and that keep you fit for your basic activities of daily living, right? And you'll be surprised that this doesn't require much at all. In fact, a basic squat, pull-up, push-up, basic stretching, and maybe a little bit of walking takes care of that. But again, most people aren't going to be happy with the minimum. And also, if you really are interested in longevity, you want to become as fit as you possibly can, because the degree to which you can, the fitter you are, the more we can delay the decline of our physiological abilities. So the next domain is what I call the specific domain, that we want at least the basic foundational fitness and preparedness for life, our activities of daily living, but then also maybe for our specific sport or our hobby. Next, obviously, if you want to go, all the way and fulfill your potential, you want to focus on what I call integrated optimal physical development. And in fact, when you do focus on this, you basically take care of your foundational fitness and even your sports training, sports-specific conditioning. Of course, you'd need to still, spend some time practicing the skills that are highly specific to your sport or your hobby. But when you focus on integrated optimal physical development, you will have the highest transfer specificity of any type of training. And of course, 10X doesn't provide you with all of that, but it gives you the best foundation for both the foundational category, your sports-specific conditioning, and of course giving you a foundation to pursue your physical potential. This image here illustrates that. Again, for just basic fitness, do a squat. Here is almost like it's the same as number one, doing a squat, but doing a squat and learning how to generate a lot of force or power coming out of the squat, maybe because you're a basketball player or a high jumper or whatever the case may be. But you can basically see basic fitness to something more specific, and then integral would be taking it all the way, taking the squat to its complete and final integral conclusion. Last but not least, we have what we call the individuality principle. Now, the individuality principle is very similar to the specificity principle in the sense that the magnitude of adaptation and the rate at which you adapt is highly specific to your training history, your age, gender, genetic profile, and other variables, right? And so the only way for you to really know what type of response you'll have to a program is obviously to be on the program long enough to see. However, we don't have all the time in the world for you to, let's say, give every program a year to see how you respond. So you'll have to use basic logic to guide your decisions in choosing a program that will help you express your potential regardless of what response type you are. And so there are three types of responders. You're either going to be an average responder, which means that if you're an average responder and the average person, let's say, for a 3-month strength training program will pick up, 2 to 3 kgs of muscle, will improve strength by 25 to 30% as a beginner, you can pretty much expect the same. But then you get people who are hyper responders that they get way more results. They usually are, they maybe they pick up 4 kg of muscle, or they improve by 50%. And then you get hyper responders, people who, again, being exposed to the exact same exercise stimulus doesn't respond as well. Maybe they only lose 1 kg of fat, pick up 1 kg of muscle, only develop 10% of strength. And so you don't know what type of responder you are until you've been on the same program for a long enough period of time. So this graph illustrates the different types of responders. So again, the blue here represents what we call the average responders, but you can basically expect to achieve what is pretty much average over a certain period of time for a particular type of exercise program. And it's usually represents 68% of people. And these people, they vary minimally, between each other. So there's almost no variability between the magnitude and rate of adaptation. And then the red here is represented by about 27% of people will vary quite noticeably, that either they won't respond as well. Again, assuming that they do everything you tell them to do, you get people that about 13.5% of people literally who don't respond as well. And then you get people who respond really, really well, and it's quite noticeable. Then you get in the green, you get people who respond quite significantly compared to the average person. And so here you can see that about 5% of people will either be, or let's say 2.3% of people here will really take a long time to see the same rate of growth as compared to the average responder. And likewise, you get people who just so much as look at a machine or an exercise and they adapt, or they lose weight and they pick up muscle. Almost seems unfair, but again, these people exist, and so these people in green represent people who vary quite significantly compared to the average person. The next image illustrates this point beautifully. What you're looking at here are world-class gymnasts who've been exposed to the exact same training stimulus for the exact same period of time, and yet they produce very different body types. On the left here, you have Kenzo Shirai, who's a Japanese gymnast, and as you compare him here with Arthur Delaloyan, one of my favorite gymnasts, you can see their bodies are completely different. And even a more illustrative image is these two American gymnasts who are on the exact same program, and again, look at how differently their bodies respond to the exact same training stimulus. However, to be fair, their performance in terms of strength and flexibility are almost identical. That's just why they are world class. So in closing, the three things I want you to keep in mind when it comes to individuality principle is the fact that just because you are not responding as quickly as you would like to your program doesn't mean you're on the wrong program. It probably means, or it could mean, that you are a hypo responder. You don't respond with the same magnitude or at the same rate as the average person. Likewise, if you're someone who adapts very quickly and with great effect, that doesn't mean that the program that you've selected is the best program either. It just means that, no matter what you do, you're going to respond really quickly. So this brings us to the last consideration, which means is how do you know what type of responder you are? Now, you will not know what type of responder you are until you've exposed yourself to an exercise stimulus long enough and consistently enough, and compare yourself to other people who have done the same to see, and compare your results to theirs to know more or less what type of responder you are. And until then, you don't know what type of responder you are. And so the best tools you have in your toolkit is to have a very deep and basic understanding of these principles, so you can select the program that you think will give you the best response possible in the shortest period of time. And we believe that 10x is that program, because remember, 10x doesn't produce better, greater results faster. It produces probably the same results compared to other solid traditional resistance exercise programs. It just does so in 10 to 20% of the time.